The Need for Ego Suppression. By Roage. The ego is the fearmonger, deceiver, the filter and editor of experience for the observer. When one operates from the self, then there is none of this fear, deception, filtering or editing. However, the self controls the ego and uses the ego to provide negative reinforcement in our experience for the benefit of the observer, until the observer decides it has served its purpose and it is placed back to where it belongs as purely a defense mechanism and not the governor of our experience. The ego remains to make the mess it is designed to make. For this reason, much of the negative aspects of our experience are removed, as there are positive ways to gain experience that do not need to rely on fear, pain, suffering and misery to manifest the lessons. When one chooses to exist in the self, the ego is suppressed and one is modified or altered such that they operate with different perception. The ego can only perceive from physical senses, material entities. The self sees beyond what the ego can see and hears what the ego cannot. The self is an intuitive tool that pierces the material facade and can sense meaning and purpose. The ego sees how and what, the self sees why. The ego fools the observer into concluding that the observer has control and free will. Until the self takes control of the ego, that illusion persists. One of the primary fixtures and lessons in the game is that one can appear to be controlled by others when they operate exclusively in the ego. This is why we are conditioned to choose to follow in the footsteps of those that came before instead of figuring out things for ourselves. It is a lesson in laziness and teaches us the proper focus for our trust. One must know what is being ignored when one is ignorant and the effect that ignoring has on our vision, intellect and wisdom. The self teaches us these lessons by allowing us to fool ourselves into thinking we are at the mercy of the majority and others. This is the idea that we will be delivered into the hands of the evil men if we turn our face from on. When the observer chooses to awaken the self, it takes conscious control and moves from the background to the foreground. The self then drives the experience for the observer. When this occurs, the observer sees the trick the ego has played on it, and the observer realizes that the self has always been in complete control for the benefit of the observer's experience. One cannot by force of will suppress the ego. This is like asking Congress to cut spending. It cannot tame itself, as its function is to maintain control even to the death of the body in most cases. This suppression must come from outside of the ego by a superior governor and mechanism, the self. This forms the objective of all the teachings on the Roage site. I know what is required to suppress the ego. Once the ego is suppressed, one gains new perceptual tools and is not hampered by that monkey on the back riding roughshod throughout one's experience. Confusion is a desired purposeful product of an experience dominated by the ego as a lesson to cause us to look for ways to escape its grip. There is a way to suppress this menace. I found that way.